Good evening. I'm Jeffrey Harper, I'm Director of the National Humanities Center, and I'd like to welcome you to this keynote address, this conference on human rights and the humanities. This is the first of what will be 3 annual conferences on this themed events that will anchor a multi-dimensional inquiry into the historical and philosophical and cultural aspects of human rights. Our partners in this undertaking are the Carnegie Corporation, Duke University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina State University, and the indispensable Research Triangle Foundation. And I'd like to start by thanking them for their support. We're putting our shoulder to this particular wheel because we feel we can make a real contribution. The subject of human rights is so ubiquitous in today's environment that it's easy to feel persuaded that we actually understand it. What could be more self-evident, after all, than the premise that everyone has a right to decent treatment, no matter where they're born? What can be more comforting than to think that we can gather together all the otherwise unthinkable atrocities in the world and declare them to be in violation of something like a law? So compelling is the concept of human rights that, as one writer has put it, it has become the universal language for making fundamental political and moral claims. We encounter the term every day in the context of stories about trade and labor practices, penal codes, cultural customs, environmental issues, and reproductive rights. People who are alleged to have suffered human rights abuses include residents of Gaza, the victims of honor killings, women prevented from having an abortion, people living near toxic sites, and George Soros, who claimed that his human rights had been violated by a French court when they convicted him of insider trading, and actually took his case to the European Court of Human Rights, which, however, upheld the verdict. Those accused of perpetrating human rights abuses include tribal councils that sentence women to death by stoning, the Lord's Resistance Army, and Royal Dutch Petroleum. But ubiquity does not mean consensus or even coherence. Hannah Arendt wrote long ago about the perplexities of the rights of man, and these perplexities have only multiplied in the current era of human rights. At every level, the concept is conflicted and contested. Virtually no nation that is accused of tolerating or committing human rights abuses has conceded the point, and sometimes even a supposed victim of such an abuse will disagree with the supposition. Nor are academics agreed on the relevant history, the fundamental concept, or even the utility of human rights talk. There's a substantial school of thought that suggests that the term itself contains a hidden human rights violation. Others point out that by invoking a universal norm, the concept of human rights cuts across the principles of national self-determination and cultural particularity. And some feel that an emphasis on human rights actually mystifies and sentimentalizes the issue by focusing our attention on the sufferings of the few rather than on systemic injuries or injustices that affect the many. The premise of our initiative is that these are not minor difficulties to be swept aside in the search for remedies. They are serious issues to be studied, and not as questions of law or policy alone, but as historical, philosophical, or cultural questions, in short, as questions to be put to the humanities. Many of the leaders in the humanistic inquiry into human rights are going to be participating in this project. In fact, a goodly number of them are here this evening. It will be our protocol in the sessions tomorrow simply to begin the discussion without elaborate introductions of each speaker, which would consume all of our time. But you have on your seats here a little pamphlet that gives you basic facts about each speaker. If you'd like more information, you can simply approach the person and ask them to tell you why they are so famous, and I'm certain that they would be happy to comply. I will make an exception, however, for this evening's speaker, Elaine Scarry, who bears the formidable title of the Walter Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and the General Theory of Value at Harvard University. When I first met Professor Scarry in 1976, we both bore the title of assistant professor, and neither of us, I'm sure, anticipated that our paths would one distant day cross at an occasion like this. The turning point that set both of us on our paths came in 1980 when Elaine went to some kind of retreat out in the woods to try to get a grip on her great sprawling book project. This was an absolutely impossible project. I remember asking her what she was working on, and she said, memorably, pain. Definitely not a prudent choice for a first book which had to be completed on a certain timetable. But when she came back from that year in the woods, these woods, at this place, this was our second class with Cleanth Brooks, Paul Ricoeur, and Bill Luchtenberg. She seemed to have turned the corner on what would become one of the great scholarly books of our time, stunningly original, massive and majestic in conception, and moving in its moral passion, The Body in Pain. I first heard about the National Humanities Center from Elaine on her return and concluded that if one could wrestle such a subject into submission at this place, they must be doing something right. In the years since her residency here, Elaine Scarry has become one of our indispensable intellectuals. Writing in an era when powerful intellectual currents have swept across the disciplines, she's always set her own course, and has done so with a kind of fierce eloquence that is instantly recognizable as her own, not just because it takes up unfashionable subjects, but far more unfashionably because it so manifestly issues from a deep well of conviction and is expressed in a voice that cannot be borrowed or faked. Although she has not generally given her commitments the name of human rights, anybody who's interested in human rights is interested in her work, with its extended meditations on torture, injury, and warfare. Her work has been organized around a very few fundamental dispositions and commitments: an acute sensitivity to the sufferings of sentient life, an unwavering insistence on the principle of fairness, and a conviction that imagination, and especially beauty, are aligned with justice. These commitments run like strong threads, knitting together literary and cultural analysis and theory with critiques of such worldly practices as legalized torture, indefinite detention, and the Patriot Act. She is the most suggestive theorist of the imagination that we have, and the most trenchant and well-informed critic of legal and official structures that reduce or impair our ability to imagine other people, which is, in her work, the root of a great deal of the world's evil. She has often focused on instances of wounding or injury, but the real thrust of her work is a celebration of the restorative powers of the creative imagination. Despite a conspicuously peaceable personality, she has not been afraid to mount direct and detailed criticisms of governments, laws, official agencies, even vice presidents and presidents. She has been decried, denounced, and dismissed, not as often as she has been praised, thanked, and venerated, but enough to provide a test of character, which she has passed. She has the courage of her convictions. Her title this evening, like everything else she does, could have been conceived by no one else: Beauty and the Pact of Aliveness. Elaine.